Hi everyone, welcome to episode 53 of This Valorant Life. In this episode, Adam and I are talking about practice. And if you've ever watched the NBA, we're talking about practice. So, first off, Adam, when you think about practice, when it comes to Valorant, where does that fit in? Is it customs? Is it DMs? What comes to mind for you in terms of what you prescribe and where players can improve?
The most common is some type of like mechanics practice. So I think most people are familiar with playing death matches for that. I typically prescribe death matches if it's something that they need to maintain skill for, or if their peaking technique could use some work. Raw aim is also something to train. I think it's useful in the context of developing technique, so using aim trainers I think is useful, and I would say those are the two most common ones. There's some other things you can do as well to like prescribe mechanic stuff, like custom drills, like specifically going into a custom and just trying to learn how to contact space, which basically just means walking around the map and figuring out how you want to peek them. So I would say those are the top three that are the most common.
And how do you find that it translates into the game? Because we all have done drills or have tried to do things in practice or in DMs, and then it doesn't translate into the ranked experience.
I think the most effective translation comes from the custom drills, because it's something that you can do repeatedly, and it's something that type of routing and that type of peeking you will do in a game, in the custom and in the game, is going to be almost identical. So if you decide, for example, that you're approaching a set A main and you want to jiggle the first angle and then wide peek the second, you can do that in game and in practice, and it translates one-to-one. Things like deathmatch and raw aim training and stuff like that doesn't translate as easily, because those scenarios and those fights tend to be like very different. Mm-hmm. So like sometimes in the Valorant game, like in the ranked game, your fight, instead of like that guy on the enemy team moving a ton, he might just like crouch spray you. Whereas in the deathmatch, he might be moving a lot, or he might not be. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult to get that exact situation. So for the custom drills specifically, where you're just walking around the map, I think that tends to translate pretty well. But for the others, it's a lot harder to see right away.
And what are the customs drills that come to mind for you?
There's a couple you could do. I haven't gone through all of these, but I was theory crafting it earlier this week. So I think the easiest to do would be if you're just alone. You just walk around the map and kind of imagine that you're just, that they could be everywhere, and you're just trying to be ready for all angles. I think that this could be elevated if you can find a friend or someone like that to be on the opposing side, and basically one player gets to practice their angle holding and the other player gets to practice peeking. Mm-hmm. And then you can kind of like run those reps in, just auto respawn and go about it. I think that is great. I think another drill that you could do is, if you have like a large group of people, you could do like themed death matches where everyone is making sure that they only do silent steps when they peek, or they use a certain type of weapon, or something of that nature. Maybe we're all trying to practice dead zoning when you take your gun duels. So I think that could be useful. And then the last drill that I think I'm stealing from CS is basically practicing retakes / practicing sight holds. So you could do both, but you could have like 4 attackers and then 3 defenders, 2 or 3 defenders, and the attackers are going to execute the same bomb site, and then you're going to have the other people try and defend it. And then you could run through that a couple of times, and then in reverse you could, or not in reverse, but you could have the attackers in the post plant, and then you could try to have the defenders retake it. So I think that setting up that would be difficult, but if you are able to pull it off, you'd be able to isolate a lot in that. And the only thing you would have to really consider is what util is actually realistic, because if you're in the post plant and you're on attack and you have both smokes up, that doesn't really make sense. So you might intentionally like burn one, or you might simulate the execute and then actually plant the bomb so that what util you have left over is
Mhm.
makes sense.
I think what comes to mind for me when we talk about this is that Radiant level players or high level players have played that ranked map so many times that they've already done this just through brute force. And for anyone that isn't a high level player, like what I'm hearing at least from you is if you just walk through a map and think about how to peek certain angles and how to peek certain with the expectation that people will be in certain places, you've already kind of crafted an ideal way to enter a site or to contact up to a site, as opposed to trying to make it up as you go along. And I think the important thing to point out there is we only have so much mental bandwidth, and the more that we can offload that because we've done it before, the more we actually have the mental bandwidth to be present or to be able to deal with other things as they come up. But if we're dealing with all of these things, then we're kind of overloaded and we kind of shut down.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think like when I think about my experience as a player, like I'm almost like all of the decisions and situations I've been in, I've made before. So I can focus a lot of my mental bandwidth on just gathering the information. Whereas like when I'm working with players, it's like they're so overwhelmed with the situation that they might have missed a detail on the mini map, or they might have flustered up their peak where they normally would be good. So just walking in the custom, at least for this particular scenario, could help free the mechanical side of things a little bit.
And what do you think is the dosage? You know, because there's an element of if you did this drill once, it's probably not going to stick. And yet we also would find it mind-numbingly boring to do this drill ad nauseum forever and ever. So what's the practice to playing ratio that players need to be balancing to actually incorporate some of this?
I don't know if I have a good ratio number, but my immediate instinct is like somewhere along the lines of like 5 minutes to 15 minutes in a custom as part of your warm-up even probably is going to net you really good results over the course of maybe even 1 week. I can imagine that would be very useful. Like I'm just thinking about some of the newer maps. Like I haven't played Abyss, which actually just got removed, too much, but I didn't have that much experience contacting space on Abyss. And a lot of those fights were very awkward for me. And now that Fracture is in the pool, it's actually leaving again. But doing something like that for Fracture could have also been really useful. So I think targeting it on newer maps or maps that you might be weaker on is like your value there is really high.
And where would you factor in util? Like, is this contacting with an expectation of with util, or would you see this as just dry contacting every common angle that you think is worth peeking or clearing?
I think you could do both. The immediate thought for me that comes to mind is contacting it without util first. And I feel like I find a lot in Radiant level games that we end up contacting a lot because the situation kind of devolves. Like I think about it like chess openings. The round start in Valorant is kind of all solved with util. So once like the util kind of dies down a little bit, you kind of have to actually just walk up to take the fight, unless you're playing a very coordinated ranked game. So I think for the majority of players in just the normal ranked ladder, if you're able to actually take space without relying on util and without having to rely on making noise, you can actually get a lot more space than you would expect. But most people are too afraid of actually walking forward without using util. So in this case here, I think it's very useful to practice it without util so you can confidently walk forward. And this is probably most seen in lurkers where you'll have like a Killjoy on Haven, for example, just sit outside garage instead of taking the active play and trying to clear garage without using util and walking in by themselves.
I think it could be a really fun, interesting drill where if you do get to do it with a buddy, that person holds a common angle, but doesn't tell you which one. And then you have to kind of peek every angle as if you're going to find someone. Because I think that's the one thing you see with pro players is that when they clear angles, they are so meticulous. Like you can see with
Super
the way
good.
they clear and the way they are aiming their mouse and the way they're almost preemptively crouching. They're anticipating a fight rather than being surprised by a fight and then reacting.
That's right. And the feedback loop is immediate if you do it in the drill, because it will punish any poor technique. Like if you accidentally take an extra step when you meant to peek out and stop, that extra like quarter of a second that you give the enemy might just cause you to die. Or if you ended up jiggling an angle too poorly and you showed your shoulder, that might cause you to die too. So if you are able to get your friend to do it with you, I think both of you will get a lot of benefit, one from the angle holding aspect and one from the peeking aspect.
Mhm. What does practice look like then translating into a ranked environment?
It's a bit harder, but if you were to call like a default or something, that's kind of where you can take space silently. The place that comes to mind for me is Ascent mid. Oftentimes you'll use the cat smoke and then a dart bottom mid, but actually taking market space and pizza space you don't have enough util for. So that's an area of the map where you actually might have to shift walk contact up. The same is true if you were to take cat as an attacker. You don't really drone cat. Now that would be nice, but you don't normally drone cat as an attacker because your Sova doesn't. Yeah, you want to drone sight, or you might have your Sova dart mid and then go back A main and drone A main. So there's going to be a gap somewhere if you're playing solo initiator, which means in order to take the space, you're either going to do it dry with no util and ideally silently, or you run it down with your homies and hope for the best. So if you can translate that part into ranked, like let's say you go into custom and you practice walking up cat. You do that exact scenario in ranked a lot of times, and you might open up the round with kills. But most players are scared to walk up cat without util, and then they end up not doing it, and they don't actually have the opportunity to take space. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, once you increase your comfort, you have a lot more opportunities in the round. Yes.
And I think that's an interesting question, because you were talking about like getting comfortable with angles, and as an example, you were less comfortable on Abyss, and so some of these fights and angles were uncomfortable for you. And maybe this is a bit of tangent, but I think it's important here because I wonder if we can improve on it. You often win the fights where you feel comfortable. You know, like I often think about, you know, let's say you're on Pearl post plant on A, and you've been able, because I feel like this is a really common one. If you can push up into the banana wall, I don't know what that's called, you know, like that curve wall on, you know, there's dugout, and then if you keep going, that curved wall, and you can hold that angle, and people are sometimes just W keying. And it feels like that's such a comfortable fight, right? And then there's other fights where you feel so uncomfortable that you kind of feel like you can't win it. Do you think by practicing more of these angles, you turn some of those uncomfortable fights into comfortable ones? Or do you think that they would just remain uncomfortable because they're unfavorable angles because of angle advantage?
I think you could turn some of those uncomfortable ones into comfortable ones if it really is just a exposure issue. But if it truly is like a completely unfavorable angle, then you know that, and you know to use util there instead of just fighting it, or you know to jiggle peek or jump peek that instead. So regardless, going through that, like let's say like I'm peeking Pearl B long as an attacker. If I die there 10 out of 10 times to my homie who's holding the angle, I know that I can't fight it, you know, I'm going to use util. So that's still valuable in itself to learn what is actually a good fight and what's not, and getting that feedback loop in a custom rather than throwing your ranked games.
And then ranked also gives us a different environment in which to practice things. What else comes to mind for you in terms of things we can practice in ranked?
I think this is where practicing your playbook is really important, and you want answers to common stuff. So as an example, on defense, you should know how you want to stop a fast A rush. You should know how you want to stop a fast B rush if you're playing on site. You should know how you want to aggress that space, like if you wanted to push it as a defender, and you should know how to retake that bomb site. And then the thing that I think is the most actually ROI is knowing your fast rotate positions and how you're going to flood into the site. And if you outline it just in that framework, it becomes very easy to just execute your preconceived plans. And sometimes they won't work. And now you add that nuance on top of the skeleton structure you had. So for example, let's say I'm playing Ascent and my B hold is really bad, but my A hold is really good. I might play a game on defense where I'm playing B every single round, and I'm not trying to win the game. I'm trying to get in repetitions on B, hoping that I can improve my B hold. And in the short term, that might cause me a bit of, frustration because they end up going A every single round, and I have to play A retake. But you could also see that as an opportunity to improve your A retake. And maybe instead of playing retake, you should be flanking. So you can kind of learn those situations as well and add nuance on top of your skeleton playbook, even if you are all in on one side, because you have to practice the other.
The thing I'm picking up from you is, if you have a very specific goal coming into a ranked game, you have the opportunity of, one, learning something and improving, or you have the opportunity to identify an area where you have a question for which you don't have an answer, which is, let's say you do that, you sell out and you hold B every single round. I can see that where if you are overwhelmed and you are playing a Sentinel and you should be able to hold the site or be able to delay or stall, now you just have a question for which you don't have an answer, then you can go research it, right? It's easy enough to go look up a pro Sentinel VOD and just see what they do on that site, and then see how your gameplay contrasts, because it'll be interesting because you already tried it, you already had an idea of what you should do, and now you can see what someone does, and not only can you see what the solution is, you can see maybe, hopefully, the principle by which they're interpreting how to play that site that can teach you how to extrapolate from that and play other sites. So I think that's like a really important thing, that we don't lose the opportunity to actually learn from every game. But we can't learn from every game if the goal is just to win. Like the question is too broad and the answers are then too broad. And so I really like this idea then of having a very narrow focus for games, and then that focus will give questions and answers so that we can continue to improve as players.
Yeah, I never thought about it like that, but I like that framework, like having more specific questions and situations that you can solve, then creating more questions. Like it's like a tree, it starts branching off, and if you don't have that like base point, your branches aren't going to really come out like well. So I like that. I think that makes sense.
The other one we were talking about beforehand was the episode, I think 2 episodes previously, we were talking about the 80-20 rule of just playing fast rotate. And I think for most people who are trying to play objectively correct, probably aren't doing that enough, and it isn't part of their playbook. And I think there's room then not only to just implement the 80-20, but to actually implement it by way of 100% fast rotating, just doing it every single time, so you can see how it feels and why generally it's so much more preferable to fast flood on a fast rotate than to organize a retake.
Right. I think it'll also be very interesting if people were to do that, to see how impactful their defense is. Because at least with Clove players specifically that I've worked with, it's surprising how much value they can get from playing maybe 1 to 3 spots on defense that are all fast rotate positions and doing the exact same like over rotate, and how much impact that it's actually insane. Because if you only do that fast rotate and master those spots and know how you want to flood, you don't really need to do anything else for defense aside from maybe 1 or 2 rounds. But in which case, who cares about 1 or 2 rounds if you've won like another 5 or 6 just from fast rotating?
Mm-hmm. And I think a big part of that too is just having a general default game plan for what that fast rotate looks like, right? Because once you have identified, you're just going to throw a smoke here and throw, I don't know, whatever that damaging, the decay ability they have, and then you're just going to run in and you're going to take these angles. Like now you have so much more bandwidth to just focus on your gunplay and your ability to take fights, rather than trying to balance all of these things of util and where to put it and comment.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess if you wanted to take this one step further in the practice realm, if you had enough people, you could probably practice this exact scenario in a custom,
Mhm.
so that if you wanted to go into a ranked game, you would be even better off. But that might be a bit unrealistic for some of us here.
Is ranked practice, or is it about performance?
Definitely depends on your goals. I think if you with a large enough sample size, if you treat every single ranked game as practice, you will eventually rank up anyways, because you have improved so much that you're going to drag yourself up. But I think for a large majority of players, they need positive feedback loops and would prefer to play to perform, because playing Valorant feels good to them when they do well. So I think in finding that balance, you might want to treat some ranked games as specifically for practice, and some ranked games for specifically for improvement. There's also the argument to use separate accounts for this. If you wanted to keep your main account like a pure performance account, playing to win. That's not something that I would personally use, but I could see the benefit of
Why
doing
wouldn't
so.
you do that?
I don't really like the idea of separate accounts. I like to play with my skins, and I feel like I'm gonna get to the rank that I want anyways with enough time and effort. So I don't really see the need to jump through those hoops. But that's kind of how I've always been. I know most people aren't like that, or I should say there are some people that aren't like that, and I've seen a lot of people that have multiple alt accounts, and yeah, that's completely fine with me. It's just not my approach.
I like the idea of being able to split them up, because then you could say, hey, like, let's say as an example, because this kind of follows a lot of amateur sports. My weekday games are going to be my practice games, and let's say my weekend games are my performance. And so you can have different, I think the weekday games, then maybe you could have process goals around what you're going to do in the game and what you're going to try out, whether that's selling out on a fast rotate, or anchoring this site, or trying to find work timings, whatever it is that you're trying to work on. And you're just going to focus on getting better at those things. And then on the weekends, those are the games where you're just going to be focused more on your performance. And I think for me, that would mean really focusing on managing your mental, managing your pre-round, and making sure you are locked in. And actually, this is something interesting. I was working with someone recently, and we were talking about this because I think this is true of aim. When you miss a shot or whiff, if you miss multiple shots in a game, there's this feeling or this desire to just aim harder. But we know you can't just aim harder. Like, there's nothing that you can make yourself just, it's not an arm wrestling contest, right? Aim is an output of all of, your faculties, right? And so in that inner game of tennis book, the idea is try to look and notice the hairs on the tennis ball. You're focusing on this thing that you're going to hit anyways, and then everything follows. I think Pete Carroll, who used that framework for a kickoff returner, he was getting in his head as the ball, it's a super high tension environment. This ball is coming, you're either going to wave fair catch, or if you catch the ball and someone is right there, you will get crushed, right? So, but what he did to this player was trying to get the player to count backwards from 10, such that right when the ball hits his chest, it's 0. So he's kind of focusing in on the moment. And so I wonder, what does that cue look like for Valorant? What does the cue look like that helps you lock in and focus without being too tight and trying to force? Because you can't force your flick. Like, the flick has to be something, or your micro adjustment has to be something that is a natural outcome. It can't be something that you are manually doing.
I've heard this argument used in different ways in Valorant, or this idea rather. If you're holding an angle, I've heard that you should just put all of your focal attention on the crosshair. And I've heard that if you're peeking angles, then you're actually like looking at the map or like the target. and like more like visualizing the fight itself and not really focused on the crosshair. So I think you could go that extent. I wonder as well if you were opping, like just staring into the dot could be useful, or finding a piece of texture that you want to see the pixel change for could be useful. But I haven't employed this strategy that well in Valorant based on my experience with where to put my attention in gunfights. I kind of just don't think about it too much, to be honest.
I wonder if there's a rhythm thing. You know, most golf cues when players are swinging, they don't focus on a mechanical cue, they focus on a tempo cue of like how fast they're swinging and how fast they're moving. I wonder if there's a rhythm cue for Valorant players. The players that come to mind for me are Net, C9 Net, when he's holding an angle, you often, and this, he's not the only one, but he's the one that comes to mind, is he'll do that kind of bob. He'll just kind of crouch every now and then. And the other player that comes to mind, very different, but King will hold an angle with op, and then he does that like wrist shake,
right,
every so often. And it's not like constant, but it's fairly consistent. I think he does it probably every 2 to 3 seconds. And I wonder if there's part of that rhythm that is just locking you into the flow, and where you can be focused but not hyper focused. Because I think most players have tried this. They try to lock in on the crosshair and then they lose the game. Like they can't find people in the game. And so I feel that locking in on the crosshair is probably not the right thing in most environments.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I like that.
What have you noticed players that, I guess the other one is whether you focus on the crosshair or focus on the head. What's been your experience with that?
I think that it depends on my crosshair. Like if I'm using a really tiny crosshair, I feel like I have to put a little bit more attention on where it is.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know. I find that when I'm using like a dot crosshair, I shoot slower, but I feel a bit more accurate. So,
but do you ever lose your crosshair when it's really small?
Yeah, for sure. Like I have to have an outline on really small crosshairs. But I would say the general answer I would give if I had to guess is I would look at my target most of the time. But the further away they get, the more I look at my crosshair to see if it's actually close to the target. But like if there's someone right on my face swinging out of a smoke, I don't even know where my crosshair is. I'm just reacting. But if it's like a really long range fight, I feel like I could see my crosshair in relation to the target and kind of like pace it out a little bit.
I don't actually understand the aesthetic of the really tiny crosshairs. I know like Yay was the big kind of push for it, and of course there's like the dot crosshair with Scream and stuff. But there's a general aesthetic in Valorant where you have these tiny crosshairs, and it's only like the former CS people that generally have like the gigantic crosshairs that have a gap in the middle.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if that's a little bit related to the shooting style, because like in CS you don't really tap that much unless you're using like a pistol, whereas in Valorant you tap and burst pretty frequently actually. So yeah, I wonder if that's part of it. But I've found anecdotally in my experience that using a smaller crosshair in Valorant tends to feel a little bit better than one of those bigger ones.
What about mental performance? What are the things you think that a player can practice using mental performance or improve mental performance in a game?
I think this goes back to some of what DDK mentioned with the Jared Tendler's work, but keeping track of your triggers I think is a big one. And if you know something is your trigger, then playing a game specifically to try to be aware on when you are triggered and trying to, I guess, use the tool that you created for it will be important. So the way I kind of envision this all together is, I'm getting a spam call. I'm getting a lot of spam calls recently. Envisioning this together, you would do that custom mechanics thing as part of your warm-up or out of the game. When you're in the game, you have that playbook that you want to try to replicate and play for improvement and, iterate on that. And then if you notice any like mental frustration, then you try and address that right away. I'm sure you could do the mental thing and the playbook thing as two separate things, like not having both of the attention span on both. But I would say pick one of those, and then out of the game, of course, you can always do the mechanics thing. So yeah, keeping track of what your triggers are, trying to be aware of them, and addressing them as soon as possible when they come up in game, I think would be game changing for a lot of players.
I think the noticing is the first part. What are the things that occur in your head when you get triggered? I think is huge. Noticing the common things in your head, the voice in your head and what it says. I think for a lot of players, it would be when you make a mistake. I think for a lot of people, especially anyone that's hard on themselves, they will say to themselves, like, you're such an idiot, you always make that mistake, you know? And I think there's this real thing of noticing you make a mistake is different than beating yourself up about it, right? You like have to be able to pull those apart. Like the emotion there of like being overly negative or almost mean to yourself is separate from the fact that you made a mistake. But we often like put it all together. But I going back to almost the beginning is that even when you're managing this mental performance, I think you almost go into the game with a question, which is, I wonder how I can better manage my tilt because of this thing, you know, when my teammate doesn't listen to me. And then you will have a strategy, and then the question is, does the strategy work, right? And so if it doesn't work, that means you haven't failed. It just means you've discovered that one strategy doesn't work for you. So for some people, I think the breath work, I think there's the physical embodiment, like do you need to get up from your chair? Do you need to do asanas or asanas, like magic hands?
Right.
Or do you need to do something else, right? And I think it's just, there's a lot of different options that you can explore and figure out what works for you. Because the spectrum of human variability is just large.
Yeah, I mean, I had that exact issue highlighted when I was climbing back to Radiant. I was like invested, so I was trying to pre-round every round, and then when people would blatantly ignore me, I felt like that was an ego hit, like I guess, and I almost felt like I was entitled for them to listen to me if I said something, but that's really not the case. Like if I say something, they take it as a suggestion or they might take it on board, but it doesn't mean that they have to follow it. Like I'm not like, technically you're playing a team game and you're playing with people that are supposed to be your equals. So anything I say is not a dictatorship. So when I kind of came to terms with that, I was like, oh, well, what's the next best thing? And trying to find a teammate and kind of playing with them and like making that adjustment in my gameplay, like my mental state, was a huge turning point for me during that climb.
It's helpful, I think, sometimes to be able to run through the voice in your head and question, what do I know to be true, right? So I think the thing that would tilt people is you made a call, no one listened, and then you lost the round. And then the story is, oh, these people are actively trying to lose the game. They're actively not listening to me. When maybe they're just scrolling on their phone or maybe they had to get up to get a drink of water. Who knows? Like there's a bunch and a variety of really non-aggressive, demeaning answers, and yet we jump to the ones that put us in like the worst possible mental state. And I think part of it is just, do we know that to be true? And most of the time we don't. Yeah,
that's how we are, I guess.
I think our capacity for storytelling is why we find stories so compelling. And it also means that the stories we tell ourselves really influence how we think about things, right? And so often when someone does something, we don't just chalk it up to them having a bad day. We create a story, and that affects how we feel. And I think it's just important to notice when that is supportive of us and when it isn't. And so the real question is how is this thought or story that we're telling us serving us? And it often isn't.
It's a hard thing to come to terms with, I think, especially because it's easier to put blame on your teammates. But even like with like your own individual stuff, like if I whiff a shot, the immediate reaction is going to be, oh, I suck. Oh, like that shouldn't have happened. So yeah, and then you start telling yourself these stories of like, you know, I shouldn't even be playing Valorant, I'm wasting my time. You can even say, I feel like the wasting my time thing is a common one, regardless of if it's your teammates or you. And I guess the thing that we have to come to terms with there is we intentionally booted up Valorant to spend time in there. And at the end of the day, if you're spending time in a video game, it's probably going to be wasted time. Or I should say time invested. And it's not like you're going to get anything out of playing Valorant aside from your own challenges. So if you see your own challenges in the game as a way to challenge your own mental, then you're not really wasting your time. So that reframe, I think, helps me a lot, but it's also one that I have to constantly remind myself with.
So purpose is why we do things, right? And this is from that Called Greatness book. Purpose is why we do things. Meaning is what we make of it. And so we can make a meaning out of anything, right? The meaning could be that we wasted our time, or like you just pointed out, the meaning could be, hey, I'm actually really struggling with this thing of, it sounds silly when you put it this way, I'm struggling with my emotions because of what happens in a video game that I choose to play because I enjoy it, which makes it sound a little silly. And so it's just like, how do we then reframe that into, okay, then that's just a problem I need to overcome. That's just something I need to figure out for myself that no one else will be able to figure out for me, because I need to better understand how I work. And like you said, if you can understand how something that is deeply triggering to you, how you can overcome that, that's a super useful skill that will serve you in many different areas of your life.
And I think the immediate thought that I have, the immediate thought that I would have if I was 3 or 4 years younger, is that this whole conversation feels a little bit too try hard. And I wonder if someone is thinking that right now. I want to call you out in the sense that I've been there. But it's one of those traps that I think I fell into because it forced me to look at the areas that I was doing poorly in, and the idea of putting effort into it was somehow making me like less of a player. Like, oh, I have to put this attention to make my performance better. Like I have to, for some reason I didn't do that mechanically, but like looking at my own mental and kind of checking myself there was a huge barrier. So I think people, my guess would be, have their own strengths in what they bias towards. For me, I like to look at mechanics, so I would look at mechanics all the time. But someone else might look at their games and like only review their game sense type of stuff. Or someone else might look at their mental, which probably is the more rare thing, to be fair. But I kind of want to loop it back together with the kind of 3 different categories we had here. The best practice for you might be something different than me. Like for me, the best practice for me 100% would have been the mental side of things. Whereas maybe someone else that is not very mechanically strong would be better off doing the customs and those drills. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm like landing on right now, is practice for everyone should be catered to you.
I think it's interesting that you brought that up around people looking down on someone being a tryhard, and I'm thinking about it in the sense that I think if you were looking down on other people and it's kind of, you think it's cringe to be a tryhard or to work at things, I think ultimately the person you're selling short is yourself, because I think when you are so focused on whether or not it's cringe or try hard, is actually what you are saying at some level is that you just really, really care about what other people think. And that is going to be a huge thing that holds you back in a lot of things in your life. There's this great video that we've referenced here, which is How to Live an Asymmetric Life. And he talks about everything that you want in your life is on the other side of hard. And so if you're not willing to do hard things, all of those things that you'd like to accomplish, you're not going to get there. Even the people that have already all of the natural genetic capabilities and are set up to do there still have to do the work. there's this idea around steroids that like if you just get steroids you'll be jacked. No, I mean you're going to be taking on a lot of different health risks to do that, but you also still have to do the work. You have to go to the gym, you have to be dedicated. So it's not easy. I'm not advocating steroid use, but even LeBron James is like naturally super athletic, but he does the work. Like he has to do the work. And so I just think you have to really ask yourself the question, if everything is too try hard and too cool for that, I would actually say that's more a reflection of your insecurity rather than your confidence in yourself. And then you just have to ask yourself the question, if you play that out over 10, 15 years, if you're never going to try at anything, if you're never going to work at anything, you're never going to get to anywhere that you want to get to.
I think what's also interesting about that too is like people hear these stories about these players that put in the work. Like you look at a LeBron James, you look at a Kobe, and it's inspirational to hear their work ethic and all of that stuff. But the same person can look at their own gameplay and be like, oh, that's too try hard and too cringe. And I think it's like a matter of scope. Like if you were to watch a really good movie, you're going to enjoy it and you're going to appreciate everything that went into it. And there's a lot of try hard and effort that went into it because it's a big project. But when you look at your own stuff and you're like studying for a test, or you're it's just a video game, right? And like, why am I putting so much effort into this? And I think that is, from my experience, the conclusion I've came up to, like the reason why that happens is we think we're above this thing. Like, I'm too good for this. And in reality, like that's not really true. At least what I've came to. I think that there's this saying like, how you do something or how you do something is how you do everything, something along those lines. I don't know if I fully believe in it, but I like the idea of it. And I think that we talk about it a bunch on this podcast. If you can use Valorant as like a self-improvement tool and like as a mirror to reflect all of your like inefficiencies and weaknesses, you will be better off everywhere else in your life. And the same is true in reverse. If you do Valorant very poorly, you will probably be a poor friend. If you deal with your teammates in a very bad way, you will probably be a very difficult worker to be with if you don't actually put in effort to improve yourself. So yeah, I think I've realized that for myself over the course of these years playing the game and just playing gaming in general. And I wish there was a conclusion I came to earlier before it was in air quotes too late, after I decided my career was over. So yeah, that's a tough one.
Well, you actually said everything that I was going to say. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks everyone for joining us for episode 53. Of course, we are so thankful to all of you listeners. Thanks for the comments. If you want to support us, you can join the TVL Tent. That's at Ko-Fi/thisvalorantlife. All of that goes towards a scholarship, which we should be awarding in a month or two to someone who will get 2-3 months of coaching, or 2 heavily discounted months of coaching with Adam. So thanks everyone for listening. Have a great day.
See ya.